Greetings and welcome to the Bible Paladin, your in-depth Bible study and commentary. We will continue reading the book of Genesis and ask how these stories can speak to us today. In this episode, we will be talking about Cain and Abel and the other descendants of Adam and Eve up until the time of Noah. As we've seen with the previous chapters, there are a few ways to read this. We can really see the literary and theological layers in chapter 4. On the surface, it begins like the story of a particular family, their interactions with each other and with God. But that's just the beginning.
There's more.
Yes, a lot more. Another way to read this is to see these characters not only as individuals, but also as archetypes, as their name suggests. Adam is the one who is created from the earth. Eve is the mother of the living. Cain is the one whom she produced. And later, Cain's descendants represent the various ways of life and trades of civilized people. To view this as happening within only a few generations presents a number of historical anachronisms that are difficult to make sense of. Settlements, ritual sacrifices, and of course the famous question of where Cain's wife came from.
Who? Mrs. Cain. Cain's wife.
Many fundamentalist Christian authors and theologians believe that they have reconciled some of these issues and still view it as a story of specific individuals that occurred over a short period of time, so I won't get into that. But I do think that much has to be said about also seeing it as a universal tale about the rise of civilization and how man began to stray from their creator. This, I believe, is the truth of these passages, regardless of how one views the particulars. And so with this in mind, let us read chapter 4. So I pray, we ask God for guidance as we read his word. The man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of flocks, and Cain a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, while Abel, for his part, brought one of the best firstlings of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not. Cain greatly resented this and was crestfallen. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you so resentful and crestfallen? If you do well, you can hold up your head. But if not, sin is a demon lurking at the door. His urge is toward you, yet you can be his master. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord asked Cain, Where is your brother Abel? He answered, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord then said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. Therefore, you shall be banned from the soil that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer give you its produce. You shall become a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is too great to bear. Since you have now banished me from the soil, and I must avoid your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth, anyone may kill me at sight. Not so, the Lord said to him. If anyone kills Cain, Cain shall be avenged sevenfold. So the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone should kill him at sight. Cain then left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Cain also became the founder of a city, which he named after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Methuhael. Methuhael became the father of Methusael, and Methusael became the father of Lamech. Lamech took two wives. The name of the first was Adah, and the name of the second Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal, the ancestor of all who dwell in tents and keep cattle. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah, on her part, gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the ancestor of all who forge instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my utterance. I have killed a man for wounding me, a boy for bruising me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Adam again had relations with his wife, and she gave birth to a son whom she called Seth. God has granted me more offspring in the place of Abel, she said, because Cain slew him. To Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. At that time, men began to invoke the Lord by name. These verses move through some significant activities very quickly, which is why it makes so much sense to see this as a story about a people over numerous generations instead of just a few. But let's look at the story as the text tells it. Eve has a son, and with a play on words names him Cain, I have produced. She has another son who is named Abel. We are told immediately what their jobs are and really what their lifestyle would have been. One tends flocks and the other farms, which are already signs of a growing population. Their work is derived from the way in which man was created, one who has dominion over the animals and who also must cultivate the ground for survival. Looking at the layer of archetypes, we see this as different tribal preferences: the nomad who follows the flocks or herds, and the farmer who would settle in one place. They each offer God a sacrifice, but one is accepted while the other is not. We are given no reason why. There are many theories, such as a judgment between one way of life over the other, or that Cain's sacrifice was not given with a pure heart, but neither of these is stated. We don't know God's motive. However, this does seem to be the first of a pattern in which God chooses the younger son over the older. In most cultures, the first male is typically the first to inherit the father's land, possessions, and authority. And this is even seen in the genealogies that follow. But God does not follow this arbitrary rule and shows this time and time again. We will see it with the choice of Jacob over his older brother Esau, Joseph as one of Jacob's youngest sons, and young David who would be king. Even Moses was the younger brother of Aaron. In other words, God has his reasons. Even though God does not accept his sacrifice, he tells Cain that he should not be angry, but rather act rightly or justly, and he will be accepted or lifted. He warns him that temptation is always ready to assault or snare him. Here, temptation or evil is spoken of as an animal or spirit crouching, ready to strike or trap him. But Cain does not let go of his anger and decides to kill his brother. The detail that he takes him out to a field to avoid detection also suggests that the story presupposes that settlements have already begun. It is told as a story of brothers, but can also be read as a story of how different tribes developed and became at odds with one another. The first murder is then committed, and immediately God asks Cain about his brother, just as he asked Adam and Eve what happened when they ate the fruit. Cain deflects the question and says that he is not responsible for his brother, but God knows, and says that your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are banned from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Two important things to note: the importance of blood and that of the ground or the earth. Remember, man is created from the earth and has a special relationship with it. Also, blood is the very life of a person or animal. It is sacred and is a theme that will reappear frequently throughout the Bible. The punishment to Cain is similar to the one that Adam received, but even more pronounced. The ground, now polluted, made unclean by blood, is cursed and will give Cain no produce. Now we come to the first of many genealogies in the Bible. You will notice that certain numbers come up quite frequently. They speak of a certain order to things, showing God's plan, and have the added bonus of making a story easier to remember and to repeat. 3, 7, 10, and 12 are some of the numbers that appear often. In this first genealogy, there are 7 people, and the last 3 are indicated as people that contributed something to society. As a brief history of civilization, we are introduced to the ancestors of those who keep livestock, those who play musical instruments, and those who forge with bronze and iron. We are told that Lamech took 2 wives, and like his grandfather, was also a murderer. The sin of Cain seems to continue throughout his family. After this, we come back to Adam and Eve and hear about their 3rd son, with a better result. Seth had a son who does follow God, and we learn that in the time of Enosh, people began to invoke the Lord by name. A bit anachronistic, since God's name, Yahweh, is revealed later, but it does show that there were those who had retained a good relationship with God. In many English Bibles where Yahweh would have been written in Hebrew, the word Lord is written instead, as you have heard in my reading. This comes from the tradition of when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, they used the word Kyrios, meaning Lord, instead of using the name. That is because in Hebrew, those reading the text would not say the name of God out of respect, but rather Adonai, meaning Lord, or Hashem, which simply means the name. And here's another fun fact that I learned when I studied biblical Hebrew so many years ago. In ancient Hebrew and all of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible, vowels were not written, just the consonants. This is where we get these 4 letters, often called the Tetragrammaton, which is the holy name of God, as revealed to Moses. So once vowels became more widely used in Hebrew, they would be added to make the reading much easier. The vowel points kind of looked like punctuation below the letters. However, since they would not say the name of God, the vowels for Yahweh were not inserted. Instead, the vowels for Adonai were put in. So Yahweh would be transliterated as Yehovah, even though it wasn't pronounced like that out loud. When the Bible was eventually translated into Latin, which has no Y or W in its alphabet, they continued using the consonants for Yahweh, but the vowels for Adonai. And so the name of God appeared to be Jehovah, hence the mistranslation of the word of God.
In Latin, Jehovah starts with an I.
Sorry, Jehovah's Witnesses, but that's just history. And now you know.
Knowing is half the battle.
So let's get back to the text. This is the record of the descendants of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. When they were created, he blessed them and named them man. Adam was 130 years old when he begot a son in his likeness, after his image, and he named him Seth. Adam lived 800 years after the birth of Seth, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Adam was 930 years. Then he died. When Seth was 105 years old, he became the father of Enosh. Seth lived 807 years after the birth of Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Seth was 912 years. Then he died. When Enosh was 90 years old, he became the father of Kenan. Enosh lived 815 years after the birth of Kenan, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Enosh was 905 years. Then he died. When Kenan was 70 years old, he became the father of Mahalalel. Kenan lived 840 years after the birth of Mahalalel, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Kenan was 910 years. Then he died. When Mahalalel was 65 years old, he became the father of Jared. Mahalalel lived 830 years after the birth of Jared, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Mahalalel was 895 years. Then he died. When Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of Enoch. Jared lived 800 years after the birth of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Jared was 962 years. Then he died. When Enoch was 65 years old, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch lived 300 years after the birth of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Enoch was 365 years. Then Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer here, for God took him. When Methuselah was 187 years old, he became the father of Lamech. Methuselah lived 782 years after the birth of Lamech, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Methuselah was 969 years. Then he died. When Lamech was 182 years old, he begot a son, and named him Noah, saying, "Out of the very ground that the Lord has put under a curse, this one shall bring us relief from our work and the toil of our hands." Lamech lived 595 years after the birth of Noah, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Lamech was 777 years. Then he died. When Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In my introduction to the Old Testament and the Pentateuch, I spoke about the scholarly approach that recognizes multiple authors. This becomes obvious again with these verses. We can certainly appreciate the different styles and the focus of the two chapters that we read today. Like in the first creation story, there is a poetic or liturgical cadence to these verses with interruptions in the style to highlight certain individuals. This seems to pick up right after chapter 3 without really acknowledging chapter 4. Some names are the same, and yet these are different family trees. The first being that of Cain, and this being through the line of Seth. We hear no mention of Cain and Abel in this list, but start with the third son. We are also told of the ages of each person listed in the genealogy. The style is similar to lists of kings or cities from other Mesopotamian literature, which also uses very long lengths of time for lifespans. And we continue to look at this as having two layers or meanings. We can read this with the symbolic approach as a mythological story that speaks to the rise of nations in addition to that of family. The family approach is used to show that Noah can trace his lineage back to Adam, and therefore also has the breath of God in him, the divine image within him. The universal approach sees these names as eras in which people began to populate the earth. So in either interpretation, what are the significance of some of these names and generations? The seventh name listed is Enoch, who did not die but was taken by God. This only happens to a few people in the Bible, and there are other references to Enoch both in the Bible as well as literature outside of it, but no real information is found about him other than that he was favored by God. Many traditions and myths have risen regarding his life, including the Book of Enoch, which was never included in the Bible, but was an ancient Hebrew apocalyptic text that was attributed to him, and continues to have some following. In the 10th spot on the list, we have Noah, whose story we will hear shortly. Then we have all three of his sons listed, which changes the cadence of the list. Of all the others, we are only told that they had other sons and daughters. There's also an interesting prophecy concerning Noah. He will bring relief regarding the curse that was given Adam. The meaning of this will become more clear as we continue. We won't get into his story until next time, but I do want to go into the first few verses of the next chapter because its inclusion here is a bit odd and has given rise to lots of interesting theories. We are told about the Nephilim. So let's continue. When men began to multiply on earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of heaven saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and so they took for their wives as many of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not remain in man forever, since he is but flesh. His days shall comprise 120 years. At that time, the Nephilim appeared on earth, as well as later, after the sons of men had intercourse with the daughters of man, who bore them sons. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. A number of questions come up immediately for me when I read this. Who are the sons of God? How do they reproduce with human women? And what does this have to do with giants? The Hebrew word Nephilim is typically translated as the fallen ones, but in some references has also been translated as giants. Remember how we talked about the possibility of God talking with his heavenly court in the earlier chapters? This theme is continued, and it seems that even in heaven, not all of God's attendants are good. This is before any developed theology of angels and devils, and seems to be influenced by the beliefs of surrounding cultures during this time period. Many societies, including the Israelites, had legends of giants, and this is revisited in some of the stories of their Philistine enemies. But what is the context here? This comes right before the story of the flood, which will tell us how wicked humanity had become. It seems that sin is not limited to the actions of man, but has impacted all of creation, even in the heavens, which suggests the first idea of fallen angels. Another theory holds that sons of God can mean the descendants of Seth, the good son of Adam and Eve who lived, and that the Nephilim were those of his bloodline who rejected God. This Sethian view was held by many Jewish theologians as well as Augustine and other church fathers. Verse 4 also might give a clue that could provide yet another speculation. We are told that the Nephilim were the heroes of old. It's almost like the author is breaking the fourth wall. Since the Bible tells us nothing of any heroes yet, except for maybe Enoch, they must be referring to other myths and legends, stories not from God. Another hint to the decline of faith, a time when people are making up their own stories instead of those from God. Just a thought. We talked about a lot of different themes today in just a couple of chapters, but what does it all mean? What can we take away and apply to our lives? I would love to hear your ideas as well, so please feel free to write down your thoughts in the comments. When God rejects Cain's sacrifice, he is crestfallen. He doesn't understand why, and this upsets him. God tries to comfort him and tells him not to be angry and that if he does better, he can hold up his head and even overcome whatever sin is pulling at him. God doesn't want us to fail. He acknowledges the difficulty and the pressure that seems to stalk us, but he also knows that we are capable of overcoming those temptations. These words are comforting. They speak of a God who is on our side, one who wants us to succeed. Of course, Cain does not follow this advice and immediately gives in to his anger. When we look at his motives, how often do we see that same attitude today? It begins with a disagreement and lack of understanding. We fear what we don't understand and end up disparaging and hating what we don't comprehend or agree with. This fear becomes anger and hatred, which often ends in violence. For many, it's not necessarily physical violence, but the violence of words or ridicule. It's seen in every political debate and infiltrates just about any conversation on the internet. We attack what we don't understand, believe in, or agree with. What would things look like if instead we sought to understand? And even if we don't agree, we could still respect one another? When Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" the answer is yes. Yes, you most certainly are. We are all each other's keepers. In the words of some of the characters in the Chronicles of Narnia, we are all sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. I think that the world would be much different if we behaved as if that were true. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing the book of Genesis as we dive into the story of Noah and the flood. Until then, watch out for your brother and sister, and do good.